When the hospital called, saying my husband was in the ICU, I hurried there with my heart pounding harder than my footsteps. I was only a few steps from his door when a nurse stopped me, eyes filled with urgency. "Please step in here and stay out of sight," she whispered, guiding me into the next room. I stood there confused until a woman I'd never seen walked calmly into my husband's room as though she had every right to be there. I watched in silence as they spoke, and the words drifting through the doorway didn't belong to strangers. They belonged to people sharing a life I knew nothing about. "My name is Alina Marsh, and I am 70 years old." The phone rang just after dawn, when the world was still soft and half awake. A calm hospital voice told me my husband had been admitted to the ICU after collapsing at work. I listened carefully, gripping the edge of the table while the kettle hissed beside me, forgotten. They said he was stable for now, which is the kind of phrase that keeps your heart suspended in midair. I threw on the first coat I found, locked the front door twice out of habit, and drove with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. After 50 years of marriage, the thought of losing him felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing to hold on to. Hospitals always smell the same: disinfectant, coffee, and quiet fear. She moved through the corridors as quickly as her legs allowed, following blue arrows on the floor that all seemed to point toward worry. Nurses hurried past with purposeful expressions, pushing carts that beeped in restless rhythm. Every door she passed revealed a different world: families whispering, machines humming, lives changing. At the ICU desk, she gave her husband's name and tried to keep her voice steady. The nurse nodded but didn't immediately wave her through. Instead, she made a quick call, her expression tightening just a little. That tiny change, that flicker, was the first sign that something wasn't quite right. A younger nurse approached, eyes kind but alert. She placed a light hand on her arm and lowered her voice. "Please come with me for a moment," she said, guiding her a few steps away from the main hallway. There was no drama in her tone, only urgency wrapped in gentleness. "I need you to trust me," she continued, glancing toward the ICU doors. "Stay out of sight for a few minutes. It's important." Confusion swirled with fear, but there was something steady and protective in the nurse's face. So she nodded, letting herself be led, heart pounding, mind racing with questions that had no answers yet. The nurse opened a door to a small consultation room and motioned her inside. "Please wait here. Don't step out until I come back," she whispered, then slipped away before there was time to argue. The room was quiet except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. She stood near the door, unable to sit, peering through the narrow crack where the latch didn't quite meet the frame. From that sliver of space, she could see the doorway to her husband's ICU room. Every instinct screamed to go to him, to hold his hand, to be a wife at his bedside. But something stronger, the nurse's urgency, kept her still. Moments later, a woman appeared at the ICU doors, well-dressed, confident, walking with the familiarity of someone who belonged. The staff didn't stop her. She headed straight toward the bed where he lay, brushing her hair behind one ear as though preparing for something intimate. From the narrow gap in the door, she watched the woman take a seat beside him, fingers resting lightly on his arm. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, no confusion. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who felt entitled to be there. A slow, cold realization began forming, the kind that doesn't fully land until it finally hurts. Voices drifted down the hallway, soft but clear enough to pierce the silence of the small room. The woman leaned closer to the bed and spoke gently, almost affectionately, as if they shared a life only they understood. She heard mentions of travel, hidden plans, and promises whispered in the dark. Then came the words that cut deepest, the woman calling him "my love," speaking about a future that clearly didn't include a wife waiting at home. Each sentence stole another piece of certainty. The world she thought she knew tilted quietly, and nothing felt solid anymore. She closed her eyes, pressing her hand against the cool wall to steady herself. There were no dramatic tears, no trembling collapse, just a deep, hollow ache settling into her chest. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers from the next room while machines beep in steady rhythm. She understood then why the nurse had protected her, kindness wrapped inside caution. When footsteps finally approached the consultation room, she straightened her back and dried her eyes with careful dignity. Whatever came next, she would face it calmly. Not for him, for herself. On the drive home, she replayed every small moment that once seemed harmless. The late meetings, the unexplained weekends away. The phone turned face down on the table. Each memory clicked into place like puzzle pieces she'd been too trusting to arrange before. She remembered the sudden interest he'd taken in privacy, insisting certain bills be emailed only to him. She thought it was stress. She thought marriage meant believing the best. Now she saw it differently. Secrets don't usually arrive with drums and trumpets. They slip in quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as normal life. Sitting at her kitchen table, she understood that the conversation she'd overheard wasn't a mistake. It was the truth finally stepping into the light. and it refused to go back into the shadows. The next morning, she opened the filing cabinet where years of neat folders lived, each labeled in careful handwriting. Bank statements, insurance forms, investment records, the paper trail of a long marriage. Slowly, she began checking dates, withdrawals, deposits, recurring payments. Patterns emerged she had never noticed. Transfers to unfamiliar accounts, hotel charges in distant towns, gifts purchased but never seen at home. None of it looked accidental. It looked planned, systematic, practiced, hidden in plain sight. Her hands trembled, but her mind stayed clear. Betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was financial, deliberate, measured. She realized that if she didn't act now, the damage would stretch far beyond heartbreak. It would steal the security she had spent a lifetime building. She took a notebook and began lining up dates, matching statements to memories, business trips that coincided with unexplained charges, medical conferences that weren't listed anywhere online. Anniversaries he'd forgot suddenly made more sense. The woman in the ICU wasn't random, she was part of a carefully constructed second life. Each discovery cut deep, but knowledge also gave her power. She wasn't lost anymore. She was navigating. For the first time, she allowed herself to ask difficult questions. How long had this been happening? Who else knew? And most importantly, how much of the life she'd lived had been real, and how much had been performance? The answers hurt, but lies uncovered are still better than lies believed. When she returned to the hospital, the same nurse greeted her with a soft smile that held unspoken understanding. In a quiet corner, she explained that policies required honesty, and she couldn't allow a spouse to be blindsided again. The nurse didn't gossip or speculate. She simply confirmed that the other woman visited often and was listed as an emergency contact. Hearing those words felt like cold water poured through her veins, not shocking anymore, just clarifying. She thanked the nurse sincerely. Sometimes help doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from a stranger who believes you deserve the truth, even when it hurts. Walking back down the hallway, her steps were slow but steady. Knowledge had given her balance. Back home, she gathered everything carefully, printed records, dates, receipts, notes from conversations, and her own written recollections while memories were still fresh. She wasn't driven by revenge. She was driven by clarity. If she ever confronted him or faced questions, she wanted the truth organized and undeniable. Each page she added felt like a brick, building a wall between the person she thought he was and the man he had chosen to become. The hardest part wasn't the deception itself. It was realizing how easily he had lived two lives without hesitation. Yet even through the ache, a quiet strength began forming. She might be hurt, but she was not helpless. She contacted banks, utilities, and offices he dealt with, asking for statements and confirmations as the lawful spouse on the accounts. Each envelope that arrived carried another piece of the puzzle. Some showed loans she had never agreed to. Others revealed assets she hadn't known existed. She made copies of everything and stored them in a discreet folder that never left her side. At night, sleep came in brief, restless fragments, but her resolve didn't waver. If life had placed her at a crossroads, she wanted to stand there fully informed. Truth, once seen, refuses to be unseen, and she refuses to look away again. One evening, she sat quietly in her living room, the folder resting on her lap. The woman who had walked into the ICU in fear no longer felt fragile. She still hurt deeply, but the shock had cooled into determination. She understood that dignity doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means facing reality with steady hands and a clear voice. She wasn't ready to confront him yet. That day would come. For now, she focused on protecting herself, her future, and the life she still intended to live. She straightened the papers, took a slow breath, and whispered to the empty room, "Enough." And for the first time, the word felt like power, not defeat. The first call she made was to her bank, voice steady even though her chest still ached. She requested new cards, new passwords, and multiple verification steps on every account. Joint access was reviewed line by line, and anything that could be separated was placed under her sole control. She set alerts so that even the smallest transaction would reach her phone instantly. Money had never been a weapon before, only a resource. But now she understood how easily it could be misused. As she hung up, she didn't feel greedy or harsh. She felt safe, for the first time since discovering the truth. The future no longer felt like something that could be stolen while she slept. Next, she met with a lawyer who listened quietly while she laid out the facts, the documents, and the timeline. There was no drama in his response, only careful questions and calm explanations. He spoke about marital rights, hidden assets, and what the law considers betrayal. Together, they created a plan that protected her home, her savings, and her medical security. He reminded her that truth matters, even when it arrives painfully late. Walking out of the office, she didn't feel angry. She felt informed. Knowledge stopped being a wound and became a shield she could finally lift. She didn't announce anything. She didn't accuse, argue, or demand confessions. Instead, she returned home and went about her routines as if nothing had changed. Meals were cooked, appointments kept. Conversations remained polite. But behind that calm exterior, every document was now secure, every password strengthened, every risk removed. She understood that reacting in anger would only create chaos, and she refused to lose control of her life twice. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be powerful. It allowed her to move carefully, thoughtfully, and without intimidation. She wasn't hiding. She was preparing. As more records arrived, the picture sharpened. There were accounts opened without her knowledge, small investments in unfamiliar names, carefully timed transfers. None of it had been accidental. Each page confirmed what she already knew in her heart. That deception had been an ongoing habit, not a single mistake. She forwarded everything to her lawyer, refusing to shoulder the burden alone anymore. It was painful, yes, but pain felt lighter when it was shared with professionals who knew what to do. She promised herself she would never again ignore a feeling simply because it was inconvenient. Before taking the next step, she reviewed everything once more, every receipt, note, and statement. The truth stood solid now, impossible to dismiss. She wasn't relying on emotion or suspicion. She had proof, clear, organized, undeniable. For a long moment, she simply sat at the kitchen table, fingertips resting on the folder, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't the future she imagined, but it was the future she would face with open eyes. There would be difficult conversations ahead, maybe painful endings. But there would also be honesty, and honesty, she realized, was a form of freedom. When the documents were finally served, the reaction was shock, not guilt, not remorse, just outrage at being confronted. Accusations flew, excuses tangled into each other, and suddenly she was painted as the villain for protecting herself. Some relatives looked at her differently, unsure what to believe. She stayed calm, refusing to argue or defend what the evidence already proved. People eventually reveal who they are when truth knocks on the door. She let their reactions teach her instead of trying to change them. That night she stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker against the quiet road. The life she once knew had ended not with shouting, but with realization. And yet, beneath the sadness, a stronger feeling emerged. Resolve. She would not crumble. She would not shrink. She would walk forward with dignity, guided by truth rather than illusion. The nurse's whisper in the ICU had opened a door she could never close again, and she was finally strong enough to step through it. The conversation finally happened in a quiet consultation room, far from the machines and footsteps. She didn't yell. She simply placed the folder on the table and let the papers speak. His face shifted from confusion to recognition, then to fear. He tried to reach for her hand, but she folded them in her lap, keeping a polite distance. For the first time, he realized she knew everything, the visits, the lies, the money quietly moved away. He spoke her name gently, as if tenderness might erase the evidence. It didn't. The truth had already walked into the room and refused to leave. At first, he denied everything. Then he minimized it. Then he blamed stress, loneliness, age, anything except his own choices. She listened quietly, letting the excuses fall flat against the reality on the table. When he finally ran out of stories, silence filled the space between them, heavy and honest. She told him calmly that love cannot exist where truth does not live. His shoulders sagged as the last defense slipped away. It wasn't anger that broke him, it was the dignity in her voice, the steadiness of someone who had already decided not to carry his lies any longer. Over time, more details came out: how long it had gone on, how carefully he had hidden it, how he had convinced himself it didn't hurt anyone. She realized then that betrayal often grows in the soil of entitlement. He wanted two lives and assumed neither would cost him anything. She didn't ask for every detail. Some truths cause more harm than clarity. What mattered was simple. He had chosen deception again and again. That knowledge closed a door inside her heart, not with rage, but with finality. Some things cannot be repaired once trust has been removed like a foundation stone. From that day forward, something shifted permanently. She still visited the hospital, but compassion replaced affection. She spoke kindly, ensured his care was proper, and managed responsibilities, but the invisible thread between them had snapped. Nurses noticed the quiet reserve in her voice, the way she stood a little further from the bed. It wasn't punishment, it was protection. She had spent years giving the best of herself to someone who shared only pieces of his truth. Now she gave what was necessary, nothing more. Distance, she learned, can be an act of self-respect. With the help of her lawyer, clear boundaries were drawn. Finances separated, documents rewritten, access limited. She wasn't cruel, she was careful. He protested, then pleaded, then promised change with trembling sincerity. She listened but didn't bend. Trust is not a switch you flip back on because someone is sorry. It is a structure rebuilt slowly, if ever. For the first time in decades, she made decisions without asking what he wanted. Each signature she placed on a page felt like a brick in a wall that finally kept her safe instead of keeping her loyal. When the truth eventually reached friends and relatives, reactions rippled outward. Some were shocked. Some quietly admitted they had suspected something. A few tried to convince her to forgive and forget, as if forgetting were a duty. She refused to perform the role of the silent, grateful wife anymore. She spoke plainly, not bitterly, not dramatically, just honestly. In doing so, she discovered who truly stood beside her. Real support didn't pressure her to heal on command. It simply offered presence, tea, and a listening ear without judgment. Just when she thought the truth had finally set her free, life had one more lesson waiting: stay with me. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Day she packed up the last of her personal things from their shared life, the house felt strangely calm. No shouting, no dramatic farewells, just quiet acceptance. She paused at the doorway, looking back only once, not to mourn the past, but to acknowledge it. A chapter had ended, not because she stopped loving, but because she started valuing herself more than the illusion she'd been handed. With steady steps, she walked toward a future that finally belonged to her, honest, grounded, and free from secrets. The legal process moved slowly, like a train crawling through fog. Hearings came and went, papers were signed, and settlements were finalized with solemn efficiency. She didn't chase punishment. She simply insisted on fairness, clear boundaries, separate finances, and protection for the years ahead. When the final documents were handed over, she felt a quiet stillness settle inside her. It wasn't a triumph, it was closed. The truth had been acknowledged, not whispered or hidden in shadows. As she left the courthouse, she realized she no longer needed answers or apologies. The law had drawn the final line, and she could step beyond it without looking back. In the weeks that followed, silence finally returned to her life, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. No more frantic phone calls, tense conversations, or the constant hum of uncertainty. She woke up each morning to gentle routines: tea by the window, birdsong drifting through the glass, slow walks that matched the rhythm of her thoughts. Healing didn't arrive with fanfare. It seeped in quietly, filling the spaces that betrayal had hollowed out. She learned to rest without guilt and breathe without waiting for the next shock. Calm wasn't just the absence of chaos, it was the presence of safety. For the first time in decades, every decision belonged to her alone. She managed her finances, organized her home, and chose what stayed and what left. Independence felt unfamiliar at first, like walking in new shoes, a little stiff but promising. She discovered she liked planning her days around what nourished her spirit, not what kept the peace. She joined a small reading group at the library, learned to enjoy simple errands, and even rearranged the furniture to reflect the woman she was becoming. Freedom wasn't loud or rebellious. It was steady, intentional, and deeply comforting. Trust, she realized, wasn't something you rebuild with others first. It starts inside. She practiced believing her instincts again, honoring uncomfortable feelings instead of pushing them aside. When new people entered her life, she didn't rush closeness. She watched gently, allowing relationships to grow at a pace that felt safe. Some friendships deepened. Others remained polite and distant. That was okay. She no longer needed to prove anything: not loyalty, not endurance, not blind faith. Trust returned like spring after a long winter. Not all at once, but in small, unmistakable signs. Slowly, a circle formed around her: neighbors, old friends, a few kind strangers who became confidants. They didn't ask invasive questions or offer easy cliches. They simply showed up, sharing meals, walking beside her, sitting quietly on difficult days. Support didn't erase the past, but it softened the sharp edges. She also allowed herself to seek professional guidance, talking openly about grief and betrayal without shame. It felt good to be heard without judgment. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't carrying everything alone. Life settled into rhythms that felt both ordinary and precious. Morning sunlight across the kitchen table. Evenings spent with music playing softly in the background. Letters written to old friends. Moments of gratitude for the simple fact of being safe, steady, and at peace. She tended to small joys: fresh flowers, warm blankets, good books, and found that peace wasn't a distant destination. It was already here, woven into daily life, waiting to be noticed. One afternoon, she stood by the window and watched the world move quietly along the street. For the first time, the future didn't feel threatening. It simply felt open. She had survived heartbreak without losing herself, learned difficult truths without letting bitterness take root, and chosen dignity over despair. Whatever years remained, she would live them honestly, not in the shadow of secrets, but in the gentle light of self-respect. And as she turned away from the window, she carried only what mattered: wisdom, calm, and the courage to keep walking forward without fear.